I want to talk about Jimmy Johnson. He retired on my show
Yeah.
today, and he's made three Hall of Fames. And I said it on the air as Jimmy and I had great conversations about stuff behind the scenes. 90% of it didn't make the air, and it was just good. 90% of it was just filler and information to me that I can then pass on to the audience. But some stuff Jimmy told me I would never pass on, and that's part of what you and I do. Like we have sources, we have friends. I protect them. Jimmy told me some stories that are so outrageously funny that you could never repeat. Um, but thinking about Jimmy Johnson, one of the cool things about sports is it gets smarter over time. And like for instance, in basketball, now we shoot too many threes, but for years, somebody finally said, the math is way better if you shoot threes over twos. The math works out better. And it's like in baseball. You know what? Strikeouts, they're not the end of the world. Ground balls are. So just, we have more efficiency, we have more numbers, more math. For years, the strikeout in baseball was like, the inning ender. No, the inning ender is the ground ball. And you look at the NFL as I don't think people, some of our audience knows this, but people did not make trades before Jimmy Johnson made that Herschel Walker deal. It was just so rare. Now they make more trades by far than the NBA.
Yeah.
And do you take me back? Because you obviously are younger than me. I can remember the Herschel Walker trade. And again, I may be dating myself. I can remember the reaction. People celebrated the Minnesota Vikings like they stole Herschel Walker. And in the end, it is the seminal moment that built the dynasty in Dallas. Did tell me your thoughts about that moment, Jimmy Johnson. What do you remember him for?
Well, growing up in Northern California, uh, the 49ers might as well have been the Yankee. I was born in 84. So by the time I was coming into my own as a sports fan, 91, 92, 93, I have vivid memories of watching the NFC Championship games that the 49ers could not win. And my father, like most 49er fans, were not big Steve Young guys because Joe Montana might as well have been Michael Jordan meets Jesus. And it was not going well. And I just remember those teams were so good. But in 2020, the Super Bowl was held in Miami, and it was the 49ers and the Chiefs, and Fox had it. And I went to do a 3 and Out podcast. You were there. I was hung out in Miami for 3 or 4 days, and I went to the Chiefs hotel, and I was with some of the guys with the Chiefs. And they said, you'll never believe this, but yesterday, Andy, because the Fox guys came to practice, he had Jimmy talk to the team. And most of these guys don't know Jimmy as a coach, let alone like he was once upon a time like the best coach in the NFL and one of the great, like Pete Carroll, right, of the 80s and 90s,
Yeah.
winning in college and in the pros. And said, and these guys, I mean, the guy telling me the story had been in the NFL for 20 plus years, still on the staff to this day, said he had never seen a pregame. It wasn't a pregame speech, it was like Tuesday or
Yeah.
Wednesday. Everyone, the hair on the back of their neck stood up. Like he's like, Jimmy doesn't still got it. He could coach this team, lead us out to the Super Bowl. And he said the place went nuts. And it's just one of those personalities. And listen, Jimmy's not the biggest guy. He always had, I mean, I remember him as the head and shoulders guy when I was a kid on the commercials with his hair. But he said of all the people that Coach Reed and all the people that he's just seen come in from the outside and give a speech, it wasn't even close. That was the best thing that he's ever seen. And I think some guys, and this is like, I'm glad that Sean McVay didn't go to Amazon. Like the NFL benefited because Jimmy played a big role on Fox and
Yeah.
Fox getting the NFL changed the course of the NFL business big picture. But they did lose, I mean, a pretty special coach. I mean, it's cool to see Pete Carroll come back. Like these people
Right.
belong. And you're around a guy like Jimmy, even those who are retired. How often does he talk to Andy Reid, Bill Belichick? Like those are his people. He
Yes.
he has more in common with them than he does, media people. Even though he'll go down as one of the great television personalities with the sport in the history of the league. But yeah, I mean, I just remember having described that kind of speech that he gave to the team. Andy's no dummy. He's like, "Hey, Jimmy," and he said it was fantastic. But I remember Jimmy. and those Cowboys beating the 49ers. I remember they beat them in a rainstorm, I think the second straight NFC Championship game. And as a kid, a lot of people thought that Steve Young, I mean, can you imagine the story in 2025, the version of getting rid of Joe Montana for Steve Young and then constantly losing to this other team? So it was a really big deal when I was a kid of the Cowboys beating the 49ers.
Sorry to interrupt this great video, but please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you. Now back to the video. Yeah, it was funny talking to Jimmy about the Miami days, Miami Hurricanes, and the convicts against the Catholics, and he was so proud about how many kids had made like the honor roll, and how he was like, people just thought we were a bunch of dummies. He goes, we had a lot of good students on that team. He goes, it was Miami. He goes, there were kids that like to go out and chop it up, and he goes, that was part of it. He goes, but he goes, you don't. He goes, because I asked Jimmy one time. I may have been on the air or off, and I said, like, if I said, what is the one quality of a great team? And I asked Jimmy this on more than one occasion. He always gave the same answer: intelligence. He goes, players have to be willing to learn quickly, and then develop. And he goes, guys that don't do their work, guys that just are slow learners, he goes, it doesn't work. Great teams are intelligent teams. And he goes, because as he goes, especially in the NFL, the margins are so tight. This stuff all
Yeah.
comes down to situational football. Kansas City was not as good as Philadelphia, but the last 2 years, the Chiefs have been so good situationally. That's just smart dudes who have been around, the Joe Tooneys and the Kelseys and the Mahomes. Those dudes have been around in big games. So, I mean, I think you talked about this, the Kansas City Chiefs. When they were miking them, those players were like, when they won that Super Bowl post Tyreek Hill, they're like, we just won. We barely even know the defense. Like the
I know.
following year, it's like, so it's one of the things Jimmy always preached was you've got to have you cannot develop players if they're not willing learners, if they're not willing to put the time in with the playbook, with the schemes. You need fast thinkers. And so he just wasn't about getting players. I mean, he told me those Miami teams, he go, Colin, we struggled to get elite offensive linemen. He goes, places like New Jersey would have 4 or 5 of those guys. He goes, we struggled to convince them to come down to Miami. They're like, well, is it a good school? And he's like, yes. He said, so, people forget that those Miami teams weren't stacked. We weren't getting 5-star guys on the offensive line. He goes, but our guys developed. And it's just, I got to tell you, if you're in your 20s, you do not remember Jimmy Johnson's Miami Hurricanes, but you had to watch them when they played the big games. Florida, Florida State, Notre Dame, Penn State. They were the running rebels with Tark, with Stacey Augmon and Larry Johnson. They were like outlaws in their own sense, and it was unbelievable television.
I'd even say the Cowboys team he built, I mean, we argue this a lot with could these players play now or play before? I mean, that offensive line that just road graded for Emmitt Smith with Troy, with Michael Irvin, that offense was just, I mean, with Norv Turner, who was really like a Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan
Yep.
30 years ago as an
Yep.
offensive coordinator. I mean, Troy Aikman still swears by him. But building that team, I mean, that move he made to then accumulate, and this is back in the day. Like we don't have this really anymore because there's a clear line of like coach and GM, and they kind of work together. These GMs are also famous. Like he was the GM, right? He was the coach, the GM, and that's what pissed Jerry off, which I would say is one of the more famous front office breakups in at least in my lifetime. Jimmy
Yeah.
Johnson and the 49ers kicking out Jim Harbaugh essentially. Like it felt like
Yeah.
those two huge personalities that you just don't win. Like you get rid of a coach, they will side with the coach who's a championship level guy every single time. But I just remember those Cowboys teams being so. And the other thing is, I think people like big personalities or party guys. I mean, those Cowboy teams they were running like a cocaine ring with strippers and stuff. But
Yeah.
even Dion, huge personality. I remember asking Bobby April, who was a special teams coordinator with the Atlanta Falcons in the late 80s, early 90s, about Dion. And he said, listen, Dion's shooting music videos. He's doing all this stuff. He was always the guy sitting in the front of, our meeting. He learned anything I'd give him, he would pick up like that. And on the practice field, I've never seen a guy work harder. So I think sometimes these old school guys, because like, oh, Michael Jordan was drinking all the time. We'll get on the practice court with him, right? Oh, Michael Irvin hasn't slept. Lawrence Taylor hasn't slept. Well, then practice starts. Like they are, there is no rep off. There's no load management with these guys. Different breed, different time, different breed. But when I think of those teams, I just think of like you could put those teams right now in 2025 and they would wreck shop.
Yeah, and there are, it's funny, Lawrence Taylor, a Michael Jordan, a Michael Irvin. I've known guys, not many, but I've known a handful of guys that they're just wired different. They got different genetics, and they can play 36 holes of golf in South Carolina in August and go out and party till midnight, and they're up at 6, and they can do it like 4 straight days. I do it once, I'm wrecked.
Some
I
people
mean,
need less sleep. Some
yep.
people do not need 3 or 4. Kobe Bryant was notorious. Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Andy Reid. Like these guys aren't sleeping 8, 9 hours. They don't need it. I need 8 hours to function. More mind to work.